after not long after, I had the privilege of working with him on his first ever exhibition in R, where he won the Discovery Award, which was an incredible moment. And that experience was a real honor for me. And now in 2025, just a few weeks ago, Rahim opened his first solo show, Reflections, at the historic Howard Gallery. And I must say that watching his practice evolve over the years and seeing his unwavering dedication to the craft has been both a pleasure and an inspiration. Um, and I imagine that if most of you are here already today, is that you know his work. But to sort of introduce him a little bit more, sort of Rahim was born in 1994, and he's a visual artist from Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. Through photography, he sort of questions the complexities of American identity, and we will talk about this today. And his work has been now exhibited internationally and held in major permanent collections in Atlanta, London, Virginia, Kansas City, and Boston. But tonight we're speaking in the context of his nomination for the prestigious Deutsche Photography Foundation Prize, which recognizes his continued exploration of the American South, its fraught histories, persistent violence, and lived realities today. I recently reviewed Hartak for 1,000 Words, and I reflected on the ways in which Rahim engages with the South's traditional iconography, cowboys, churches, Southern mothers and daughters, rodeo, satches, coronations, etc. And you'll see some of these images on screen shortly. But what I wrote, but when I wrote that piece, it was before Trump's re-election, at a time when I still held onto the hope that photography and conversations about visual culture could help us reckon with America's future and the urgent need for deeper, more nuanced historical narratives. And today we're looking at this work with a very different context. The title, Heart Attack, so I'm going to show you the book here, is means a sort of survival ration made of flour, water, and salt. And it feels like an omen, a stark reminder of the previous moment sort of precarious moment we find ourselves today. And that sort of brings me to my first question for Rahim today. How are you? And how are you processing everything happening in the US right now? Particularly in light with sort of your ongoing engagement for representation of the US and America.
Yes, thank you so much for the beautiful intro. It's always great to speak with you, and thank you for everyone who is joining us today. It's been great being a part of this exhibition and shortlist. But to your question, how am I? I mean, you know, I feel as though being a young person coming of age in a second Trump administration, I mean, he took office during my mid 20s, and now that I'm into my 30s still dealing with the second Trump administration, paired with the 4 years of pandemic and you know, swaying economics of the states and of the world. I mean, I think everyone's in a bit of a collective shock, and you know, I just think that it's important to stay vigilant and stay engaged and not to become passive in the things that are going on. But also as an artist, it's something that I want to just observe how the relationship of documentary aesthetics and that history intersect with what's going on today. And for me, I never feel as though I want to make work from a place that is reactionary. So I'm not necessarily drawn to respond to this, but to continue on my practice, which is more of a kind of nuanced and long form engagement with these interpersonal and where the personal meets the political. And so, yes, just trying my best to carry on and learn and help where I can. And,
Yeah. And what you just said is a perfect reflection of attack, and it took you quite a few years to make that book. And I guess I wanted to ask you about your position. And before we started that conversation, we were talking about the idea of like photographing like outside the US, but you were born in Oklahoma, and you live between sort of Austin and Brooklyn, New York, and you are deeply embedded with the idea of documenting the American South. And as you just said, like on a personal and on a political sort of side and a political way. Um, and so, and in your pictures and in Heart Act, you sort of engage with sort of critical thinking about sort of symbols and monuments you might sort of represent, but also you engage with sort of more personal aspects, and you engage in conversation with friends or people who might sort of become friends. Sort of with that in mind, I was thinking about the question of positionality, right? And how where we stand shapes what we see in a way. And you hold both sort of this insider perspective, having grown up in these places, but also an outsider perspective, right? Returning to them with a different gaze, ultimately, I'm guessing. So I was wondering how this sort of dual position of insider and outsider shaped your sort of the way in which you sort of might represent the South.
Yes, and it's an interesting question, and something that comes up very much in photography. This question of insider versus outsider, and
In your case, it's not a versus, it's and, right? It's both.
I really do agree with that, in the sense that as someone who is making photographs, you are doing something that is outside of maybe the perceived norm. So that automatically gives you a kind of peculiarity, of maybe the flow in which things normally take place. But I mean, I'd also think that's where community photographers come in, and um, there's so much that I could say about that. But thinking about how you tread that line, I think is beautiful, in the sense that there's fleeting interactions, there's sustained interactions where you photograph someone more than once, um, and there's also times where I photograph people over the course of years, and so there's no kind of one approach. But what I will say about the work in hardtack and creating that kind of personal connection to it, um, I after making the work that was about my family and making the work that was about my father and my grandmother, who are very much, products of, Virginia and Texas and Florida and these places where I would return to photograph, um, was very foundational. And now that they have all passed on, um, I think you hit this kind of crossroad as an adult where you decide if you're going to go further into community. There's even if you grow up within these places, it is a decision at a certain point to continue to engage in this kind of social, very social form of work. So for me, that is very important and also an extension of what I would consider extended family. Now that my grandparents and parents have passed on, I find that connection with people. I mean, the photograph that's on the screen now is one of the G's bin quilters, and we'll speak more about that later. But it just various vignettes of things that remind me of my family, um, and also maybe other people who are in some kind of need of that kinship as well. It's a two-way streak, and to me, that is what makes up a group of people who have a kind of identity or political connection and sense of agency. True.
Yeah, and there is this sense of maybe sort of chapters, how maybe the previous book, I Can't Stand to See You Cry, was sort of something that obviously sort of reflected on personal history, but there was like characters that kept coming back. And I feel like Heart Attack has all that too. It's sort of there's this idea of remembering or remembrance that feels like it plays a central role in your work, paying homage in many ways, and sort of um, it could pay homage to people, to architecture. It tries not to forget. I mean, obviously, in the other book, it was also linked to grief, so not to forget the people you live with and you lived with. But this is also felt like sort of classic, right? Sort of engagement with the people we don't want to see go, or the situations we don't want to see go, or the architecture we don't want to see go, especially in contexts that might be threatened by gentrification or change or economic situations. So yeah, I guess my question is about remembrance and remembering and how this plays a role into your image making.
Yes. I mean, I am always at conflict with this notion of um, nostalgia. My
Mhm.
work is something that plays heavily on nostalgia. And so I think that there is a troubling side of nostalgia, especially in the sense of holding on to things that you can't let go. And I think in the way in which that connects to loss is um, slightly obsessive as a part of the processing or healing process where, um, and it's something that we spoke about before, especially like places that are kind of become figments of memory and of imagination. And maybe these photographs aren't a way of trying to materialize that. But I don't think that that's unique to photography. I think that music and cinema and Americana in general have for long times played on these themes. But why I say that it's troubling because I think about the way in which these ideas are also connected to traditional values and how this is also something that is worth being interrogated. Um, so it's and then I guess the last thing I'll say about it is function. How do the images function? And I wrote about this in the show catalog for A Long Arc, which was an exhibition that traveled here in the States about Southern photography. And the foundations of aesthetics for documentary photography in the South were often political in the sense that they pointed towards something that needed attention or needed help. And it wouldn't be until later generations of image makers, though you can say that there was, through editing, you could see a more compassionate view of this, but the initial function of documentary images in the 30s and 40s and so on eras were to kind of point towards poverty and to say, look at these people who need help, who can't relinquish their possibilities, but there is this kind of undeniable beauty and potential here. And I think of artists like who were my people I looked up to, like Roy de Carava or Early Hudnall or Roland Freeman, who are kind of just pointing towards the beauty. And though some of those other things might slip in there, as you said about socioeconomic, but for me, this work is not in any form of pessimism. It's a kind of unwavering celebration and um, yeah, it's not meant to kind of say, "Oh, look how hard it's been." It's really, I hope to photograph the triumphs and the grief and the anxieties and all of the mix of emotions that make life what it is.
Arc of emotions and experiences. You mentioned sort of Decarova, and I remember one of our first conversations and a second conversation we had actually in Marseille, and I was struck by your sort of incredible encyclopedic sort of knowledge of American photography and its history and sort of you were mentioning Walker Evans and De Carava and anyone who's sort of interested in photography would know those names. But you also like sort of mentioning people I've never heard of and sort of I was sort of interested in that sort of the ways in which you sort of first of all how you built that sort of visual culture of sort of American photographic history, but also what you learn from it, sort of spending so much time looking at their work and how does it sort of inform your own? Because there's clear sort of homages also in Heart Attack in that sense.
Yes, I mean, I think it really started for me when where it really started for me was when I was studying at a community college in New York, seeing some of the first photo books that really sparked an inspiration to me. And when I moved to New York from Texas, it was I had a lot of anxiety about like capital A art in the art world and museums, and it was such a far cry from where I grew up. And often when I would go in there, I would just feel like I was confronted with what I didn't know or what I didn't have access to growing up. And it made me extremely anxious. And so once I realized that I was gravitating towards photography as a medium and I was looking at images that kind of fed something in me, maybe even kind of subconsciously at first, these images that reminded me of home and of Texas and of Oklahoma and of my parents. Um, And so that would become something that was like important for me. And it gets back to that earlier idea I said about and this was very true for the work I did in Oklahoma, because that work came after a 10-year gap of living there, of not going back until my mid 20s, and of, being away from the place where you grew up for 10 years. And so I would look at archival images, newspaper photography, anything that was a visual ephemera of the place. And so that was where it really started, as something that kind of fed my spirit. So I think that, you know, these universals of photography and what it kind of fundamentally plays on, um, to me is right there akin to like listening to an album that you really enjoy, a book that, fills your mind with images that, you maybe couldn't have produced yourself, after a few pages of a good book, the worlds that open up to you. I like to, um, go there and find the physical places, and also look at the images, and it becomes a thing that also becomes about, technique and storyline. For me, learning about artists' biographies was interesting, because to learn how everyone had a different arc and a different path and a different timeline in their life when they made work, or maybe they made early work, and what, yeah, all of that also made the pressure on me a little less. It was became a bit more like an objective thing to observe people's paths and career arcs. So I find a lot of fascination in that, and so I study photography for a multitude of reasons, and tend to focus on work made in America. You know, though there's so much amazing photography around the world, that's mostly been my point of studies.
Yeah, and so much so that now you're involved with sort of editing books that sort of maybe not your own work. And recently you've curated sort of historical works from the Howard Greenberg collection, also alongside your own work. So this engagement with sort of American photo history is really you're pushing it quite far, right?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. To be able to be a voice within that, world is amazing, and to speak with people who are, very established in the art world, to introduce them to artists, and to, but I also think that that is in some way a bit of a responsibility as well, to bring up the people who inspired me. I always go back to the, kind of most basic quote of photography, of that we, stand on the shoulders of giants. But I do truly believe that. And to be a young practitioner and to get certain amounts of acclaim and attention, like, I do feel a bit of a responsibility to help other folks whose work is incredible and has inspired me to, get its due, and to, continue a conversation, and more of just an engagement with the medium, rather than just a picture maker. But and again, it does also take a little bit of pressure off of just being, like, air quotes, like a great photographer. It's kind of like that's a stressful thing. Most of the photos you make are, you know,
Mm, mm,
you
mm.
have to work it out. It takes a while to work it out, but um, allowing to being able to read and study, it gives me another avenue of engagement.
Yeah. And it's interesting because some of the people you mentioned, like Rogovin or Kanaga, that like some of the people you look at also were people who obviously sort of worked in the South. But I'm particularly interested in, I'm slightly obsessed, like a lot of people, with Walker Evans sort of pictures of architecture. But what I'm more maybe even interested in with Hardtack is the rituals that shape communities and in a way give structure to people's lives and give structure to the book. Um, like I'm thinking about sort of the rituals of mass and churches and graduations and other moments of like collective gathering that feel like meaningful milestones in people's lives and in sort of edit of Heartattack. So I wanted to sort of ask you about what those rituals means to you when you attend them, when you photograph them, and what they mean also in terms of the conceptualization of the book.
Yes, I mean, the traditions in the public, parades and, different celebrations that happen around Texas and around the South. Most of the celebrations that I photograph actually happen in Texas, because that is my home state. And, things that will draw me out to other places will, be other groups or other kind of cultural events. But to me, I was interested in how they are connected, and that was what took a while to work out. between this juxtaposition between the kind of one room church as well as the Black Freemason, I wanted to try to give not a one sided perspective on which traditions and their relationship to kind of divinity and thinking about the pulpits versus the juke joint clubs and how there's this kind of connected tradition through organizing, the church always being a place for political and community organizing, um, and its influence on music and also on dress. There's a big element of um, being dressed up in this, is something that's very fascinating. So that's how I was also very fascinated in the way in which the traditions were kind of worn on the clothing. They're not necessarily just, there are photos that work their way in that are maybe more on a street or kind of road trip manner, but a lot of them are, as you said, these kind of people's big days and milestones. And so to participate in it is really beautiful. I genuinely enjoyed, and it's something that keeps me going back every year. And though hardtack, I have released the book, there's a few things that I can't stop going to. So I feel a deep connection. And but it's it's a mode of working that is there's also a tradition of working in this manner, and seeing the exhibition at Howard Greenberg really contextualized kind of all of the different places that I had been and how my imagination and my research was the connecting thread between some of these things. But um, there's a few photographs to me in here that tie those themes together, particularly the cowboy who is riding in front of the church during one of the parades. It was kind of the picture that closed it all in here to say, ha, I didn't make it up. It's they are connected, because I didn't want to force my hand in these juxtapositions of creating a kind of imposed collective history on people. It needed to be something that was real and felt. And to me, the people in my photographs and the people who come from the similar backgrounds and culture, they are the test. And when they see it and recognize it, I know that I've maybe gotten close to doing the subject and the history justice.
Yeah, you mentioned sort of obviously the deep connection you have with the people in the book. And I've always been quite amazed by the ways in which we are able, with sitting with the books, to sort of get a sense of the deep sort of vulnerability and connection and intimacy you're able to create with the sitter, with the person you yeah, taking the photograph of. And I guess I wanted to ask you if you had any sort of considerations or comments to make on sort of the idea of care in the ways in which we engage with people, and if that sort of what it means in your practice, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, there's fundamental kind of questions around the medium or the canon or genre, however you would want to describe it, that are kind of inescapable. Some photography being a medium that uses real life as its kind of subject and as its material, makes it a bit different than other artistic practices. And so I think care can comes from a few places. I think one place where care really comes in is in editing. Um, what images you decide to choose and include, and what that says about the people who allowed you to photograph them. Um, Care and how you navigate physically being in the space, and how you navigate getting close to people to make their photographs during moments of solace, but also in sharing the work and exhibiting the work. I try hard to be in touch with everyone that I photograph, and to kind of have a line of communication with them. It's obviously not going to be the case for every single photograph, but many of the people who I work closely in collaboration with, there is a consideration in the kind of economic and public nature of the photographs. Some images are more sensitive than others, and so trying to be careful about just in the way in which they're disseminated, or maybe confronting people, because the reverence of it to be in a book or in an exhibition is a lot different than it being a social media post or a website banner. So I try to be very thoughtful and transparent with people who have opened up these worlds for me to be a
Yeah,
witness.
this is so important, and still. something that sometimes lacks elsewhere. Um, I obviously you talked about how some people open up just now, open up worlds for you. And I guess one of the worlds I was so interested in even before sort of Heart Attack and was such a pleasure to encounter in the book was the G's Bend, right? Some people might have encountered their work. There was a textile show a few months ago in London, and their work was exhibited. But for example, how do you connect with them? How do you get the privilege of documenting their work and their hands and this is gigantic legacy in the South, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Should we move to the individual images?
There maybe we can move to the individual pictures. There will be a picture of two hands on a quilt. That's the one I'm talking about.
Yes, and as we pull it up, I can speak to that. So that actually came through a commission. Um, it was a magazine that was doing a story about the festival that they do in Gisbin that is called the Airing of the Quilts. And the Gisbin quilters are a group of women who have made quilts since the 1800s in a corner of the Alabama River known as Gisbin, and it's not far from Selma, so they have a deep connection to the civil rights movement. MLK visited here, and their works have been regarded now as, as you said, shown in museums. And so I was asked to go there and photograph, and it is such a rural place that you actually have to stay at a guest house of one of the quilters. There is no hotels. Um, and the writer, who was maybe not from the South, was like, "This place is so remote," and I really thought I was going into like the corner of the world, how she described it. And then I got there, and I was like, "Oh, this is just like any country town." So I got to spend time with them, and kind of quiet time with the Tiny Petway, who is the woman shown in the photograph, and making some photographs of her and her daughter and her granddaughter, kind of three generations of quilters. Um, and I, made this photograph of her hands. She is, I believe, the eldest living of the G's Bin quilters. And so, just thinking about the legacy and the kind of work that she has produced with her hands, and the raising of families, and keeping this tradition alive. I thought it was a beautiful expression.
You have an exceptional eye for hands. There's a few pictures of hands in your work that I really love. Um, Another picture that for me um, really sort of struck me, and I think it struck me because I just sort of seen sort of Daoud Bey's work at the Getty. The Now the title sort of escapes me, but the almost pitch black prints of the plantations and the sort of underground railway. And so, thank you, Lisa. And that's the picture I'm talking about. And I guess the sort of subtle hints at history and how you do that in the work for me is really sort of powerful in the way that it doesn't display anything and withholds information for if you're not in the know also, which I find also very interesting in the terms of what you were saying about in terms of what photography does, which is sort of working with the real.
Yes, I'm trying to think of the title. I think it's "The Night Come Tenderly." It's this incredible series from Dawood Bey. Yes, it's fascinating. We were actually working kind of around some of the same areas of some of the Carolinas in the Southeast, and Dawood is someone who is a big influence in um, kind of a titan of Black American photography. Yeah, this image was made in Archer, Florida, and it shows the rail tracks from what was once a steam line train that was a part of a historic event known as the Night Rides, which the history intersects with a race massacre that happened in Rosewood, Florida in 1923. And John Singleton has done a film about this, and it's really one of the tragic stories of like Red Summer era American history. And so while I was there with the historian, she pointed out one of the sites where the tracks were available, and actually right behind you can see the train depot, which is where the train would be loaded with, I believe this was a cotton depot. Um, and so to be able to signal to that history with this photograph, but also when some of these earlier, this photograph was made in maybe 2020. Um, so some of those photographs, maybe now going on 5 years ago, there was a kind of, you know, joyful, like naive quality to sometimes how I make detail photographs. And it's something that as I've like worked more, commercially, or you focus so hard on portraits and landscapes, like these photographs, the subtlety of them, something that I try not to lose, the looseness of them and the kind of informal nature of them at times. Um, so yeah, this was a photo that I'm glad that I made, and like I try to stay on myself to not lose that keen sense of subtlety.
And I love it also because it's one of those pictures where you probably had to get yourself quite close to the floor and soil. And I think there's something quite sort of beautiful about the ways in which, when I look at this picture, I can get a sense of the noise in the trees and the sort of the sun touching your skin, and it's so evocative and so powerful. And yet you read so that was my first reaction to the picture, and then I read the in the book, the all the captions are at the end, so you sort of encountering the images as they are and read them the way you might wish to read them, and then you give in context, and then there's a bit of a whoa, okay, um there's sort of hidden violence behind the sort of obvious beauty, which I find really interesting in that way.
Yes. If you want to, is there another image that you were interested in?
Yeah. So should we sort of also talk about yeah, this one. Great. Thank you, Lisa. Um um you have an exceptional talent for portraits. And this one is also so evocative because it's like an image with an image with the tattoos. I guess could you tell to us about your relationship with the young boy, and how you sort of capture that sort of those emotions, right?
It's the person in the photograph. His name is Deontay. He's a young man that I met in Texas, and we were friends for a while. I met him at the skate park, and we were just keeping up with each other, see each other around. And I asked him if he would be interested in making some photographs. And often I would collaborate with my friends to, this is something that I also did in I Can't Stand to See You Cry. The photograph of Billy and Minsley, and um, of my sister, and these kind of collaborative portraits that are almost meant to be like a bit of like a noir, tableau of uh, blending a bit of fantasy into the project.
Mm.
So it's a collaborative portrait of a friend of mine, and the landscape that I choose returns in the project. It's this town that's nearby where I live that is like the closest like slice of old landscapes and towns, and so I go there often, and it's kind of become a joke that anytime the sun is setting, I'm like, oh, I should be out there in New Sweden, Texas, and um, so it reappears in the book. And so, yeah, I also, what fascinated me about his tattoos is there's a series of dates. And to me, those dates that are some are memorial, some are marking moments of his life, they kind of fixate him within a generation. And so, these dates that I think the way in which he kind of wears this history on his body is fascinating. And it's paired in the book with an image of a kind of exposed painted brick sign, and kind of this showing how we kind of the landscape and like how we wear this history, and this kind of use of the fence behind him. In the book, it's sequence with the photograph of a fence post, and the fence, is a metaphor for progress, perceived progress, by humans, and but also as like this barrier of kind of imposing of like saying this is stay out, this is our land. So there's a lot of metaphor in it. I always think that it serves better as a photograph than prose.
And maybe the last picture I wanted to ask you about is obviously a sort of monument of the South, right? It's the Black Church. How do you, yeah, how do you go about taking this picture?
Yeah, so this photograph was made in a similar manner. It was a collaboration with a creative director and stylist. Her name is Chastity Siobhan. She's a really incredible and talented artist based out of Houston, and we had like a good kinship. We've done fashion editorials together and many different personal projects. And so for this series that we did, she wanted to photograph her family who. Um, Represented a few of the different subjects that I was photographing. So her mother is the woman in the middle, and she is a praise dancer in a town called Edna, Texas, south of Houston. And it's the church where she grew up. And in the photo, she's teaching two young women the tradition. So it's an image about, keeping this tradition alive and also about the pride that she has in this knowledge. It was all on full display in their performance. But this wasn't during an actual church service. This was a collaboration where we, you know, styled them, and we had someone, also a hair artist, work on the hair. And so it is a true collaboration. And another photograph that to me is kind of feels early because now this photograph is going on 5 years old. And again, there's kind of just a looseness to it not being perfect that I really love about it. It doesn't feel too slick. I wasn't able to do this 20 times. It was really about this one picture where everything kind of merged together and worked out. And for this photo to be, in collections and around the country, and I think it's also around in the BNA's collection as well. So I'm very grateful and elated and owe it all to my collaborators and folks back home.
I guess you mentioned time quite a few times during our conversation. And for me, I can't stand to see you cry. I felt like a coming of age project in many ways. Well, Heart Attack and carries a sense of maturity. And I think when we had our first conversation about Heart Attack, when you just launched a book, I said that to you, I think. And I said, wow, there's a sense of a sort of arrival into the sort of full control of your craft, let's say. How do you feel about being able to live and also witness your own evolution within that work? And how do you feel about those different shifts you've taken?
Yes, I mean that's one of the great things about having your work all kind of organized and scanned is the ability to look back and look at decisions. And I think that sometimes when you're working on a project, you're always having this idea about a photo like being successful or is it working kind of thing, and it can make you feel like certain images are air quotes kind of unsuccessful, which I think is something that I've like gotten a less attached to. They have different functions, and some function just as a document, and some function just as something that I enjoyed seeing. But they work differently in the context of a book where they're pushing forward a narrative and a connection between other images. So looking back at photographs that were maybe considered outtakes or didn't make it into the book that I absolutely love. And um, as photography is also one of those things where it's always kind of about, oh, what's next, or what's, and so looking back at these at times, sometimes it feels like, yeah, very long ago. And you're always changing as a person, and what you can do and what your relationship is to things and what you're comfortable with or interested in is constantly changing. There kind of is a sweet spot for working on a project where the magic is there, the interest is there. I find that it might be hard to put something down and come back in the same exact form because you have changed. So, growing with your work, and I'm fairly selective about what it is that I share because I think that you have the benefit of that kind of time for it to live because that context does change. And so I really do like sitting on work for a while and spending time with it and being very considered before I release it. And um, you know, further like cloud up the story or the narrative. I think it's less is more at times.
Yeah, and I know you have that sort of also relationship and collaboration with your publishers, right? Loose Joints, who also talk to you about this, right? And when it's the right time to publish, or when it's the right time to sort of um, yeah, release a new project, I guess.
Yeah, I would be remiss to not speak to how much of a part Loose Joints has been in all of this, between the Sarah, who edited both books and has spent like so much time with my work and has really taught me a lot about my own work. Um, yeah, they're really special. She's put so much love into Hardtack, and I made the joke where I said a good edit should feel like a new haircut. It's like jarring the first day and you almost hate it, and then you like wake up the next day and you're like, okay, actually this is bad. This is really, really good. And because she would do decisions that I would be not something that I would have come up with, and I really loved that. I mean, there was actually a few times where I had to question if certain things were actually my photograph. But she had such a great attention to detail and a sense of what I wanted to say with the work.
I guess I could sort of maybe for the people who are on the Zoom call with us, if you have any questions you might want to think about or ask directly to Rahim, or pop them in the chat box, and I'll be happy to read them. Um, and whilst you think about sort of your questions and your comments that you might want to share with us, I guess I want to ask you the awful question of what's next. And also, will you ever do something about New York?
Yes, New York is a tough subject matter because I've lived here for nearly a decade on and off, and it's has a lot of photographic baggage. It's been photographed very much, but there is a lot of amazing work that has been made here.
Mm,
Um, that will maybe come much later. But it is a fun place to photograph, and my connection to it has grown as I, have, um, been in a relationship with a born and raised New Yorker for going on 6 years. It's definitely like an adopted home.
mm.
I didn't know one question.
Yeah, there's a question about your relationship to black and white, and both your both sort of projects, I Can Stand and Heart Tag, are both in black and white. So yeah, I guess the question is about your relationship to the black and white film.
Yes, I mean, for me, black and white film is a much different process than printing color film. There's, more flexible dynamic range, and also it just interprets a light differently. And for me, it helps to blend all of these different subject matters in different time periods by kind of stripping out color as one of the factors. Um, but I am interested in color and do make work in color. I just haven't released any of it yet because it is very slow and tedious because you are playing on palette, and um, for me, good color, you kind of have to nail it. So always working to figure out the best technical approach. So black and white was flexible. I also really enjoyed processing on film, and there's a bit more of an instant gratification to be able to see my negatives and adjust. And for the second part of the question about
The question about, yeah, sort of your relationship to the people you take sort of pictures of and how you find them, I guess.
yeah, so I guess at the core, my work is about people. Though I do love making landscape photographs and architectural photographs that kind of gesture towards the same themes. A lot of it is kind of about human condition, emotion at its core, and how I find the people is through various ways. As I said, a lot of collaboration with friends and extended kind of networks of people who I'm in conversation with. Um, and then a lot of it would be about going to different cultural events year after year. So parades and homecoming events and pageants that are held, and looking at how all these different events are connected. There's kind of different seasons for different events, and the way in which, education is connected to, different institutions. It's all in a way how the a lot of those communities function. So I would just return year after year and build my connections with the people and offer them the photographs for free, and yeah, still going at it.
really beautiful portraits of kids too in the book. I'm it's not easy. Oh, well, there's loads of sort of pictures of kids, but it's not easy to capture the complexity of kids, I think. And you do that really well. I love this one, for example.
Yes, that was made at a parade in Houston, Texas, and it's two brothers standing near their father watching the parade go by. I've always loved that photograph and the kind of maturity of the young man and his kind of comfort that he had in that image.
Yeah, it's quite beautiful, and this little girl too.
Yes, the flower girl.
Yeah, love that. Um, there's another question in the chat about, I guess, your relationship with the publishers, Loose Joints, and how did that sort of relationship come about, and how did you sort of, yeah, develop that?
Yeah, so they approached me and around like the end maybe of 2020, asking if I had any projects that I was developing, and we worked over the next year to sequence "I Can't Stand to See You Cry" and kind of nurture that project. So they did approach me. Lewis and Sarah are both very they think very deeply about photography and the ways in which their books are just very intentionally designed, from the materials to the sequencing. And um, I like to think that a lot of their books, though they also do some kind of beautiful still life and design oriented books, there also is a kind of social element behind their publishing that I find very inspiring for a contemporary publisher. That it's a lot of the modern works that they publish are political in nature. And yeah, I really just love the books that they do.
So I love I in my review of the book, I think I made the connection with Blue Jeans, but I love the textile and the design of this one.
Yes, it's a recycled Japanese fabric, and each copy is a bit different. So some of them will be more yellow than others, and I even saw what looked like a piece of grass sticking out of one. So it definitely has a bit of a feel that you know it definitely and it also ages. The text kind of starts to fade, and it has a lived in quality.
There's a question about the names, and I guess you're talking about the names of the projects, right? Um, so where did the yes, where did the heart attack name come from?
Yes, the name came from as you said earlier in this the talk. There's a type of kind of frontier ration that was known as hardtack. It's something that has a very long shelf life and was used by the Buffalo Soldiers, which were a group of you know recently emancipated folks who were enlisted by the government to work in these kind of last frontiers of the American West. And so they're the 13th Cavalry, and people in Texas, they still have a deep connection to this history and to this tradition. But so in a way, it kind of highlights a very complex relationship to Texas and to American identity. It's riddled with contradictions, and but it's very was very culture building in the sense of like this relationship to the land and to ranch work and cattle work, and the way in which that influences um, the fashion and
Yeah,
general culture.
horse culture, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And so yeah, I want to get to everyone's question, so I'll
And so there was a question about how do you build the trust in the relation and the relationship with your subject, because the person who's asking is a photographer themselves and feeling a bit that it can be sometimes intrusive to do so.
yes, I mean, I think that that part definitely there's kind of two ways to think about it, but often when I get that sense from my own photographs, I feel like maybe I don't have anything to say about the person that I'm photographing, that they're just kind of becoming this blank, like there's nothing that I'm actually saying about their interior life. And through kind of almost like a producer mind, you can game how to get close to people and how to photograph them, but how to, um, make something that is representative of almost like an interiority of their life. That is the challenge. So there is really no one way, because also in the more street photography tradition, people are still making photographs that read as candid, even though they maybe have no interaction with the people who are photographing. So I think that it's definitely something worth reflecting about, how in which you do it. I think that is the inherent challenge with documentary photography, or just photography in general. When the camera is this kind of stiff two-dimensional object, how do you get the kind of fullness and the movement of life, which comes through maybe repetition, and time invested. I think that a project that is rushed, you can maybe sense that. And so the willingness to kind of spend that time, but also the research and understanding of the subject matter, so that you know what elements you are trying to even highlight.
Interesting. We have another question from Leslie, and Rahim. Leslie is featured in Shining Lights. Leslie's asking, could you say something about the timelessness of your work? It could have been shot decades ago. Is it due to the remoteness of these rural communities, or is it a decision in your process?
Yes. Hello, Leslie. Thank you for your question. Um, yeah, so the timelessness was definitely something that was a bit intentional. A lot of this photography was inspired by community photography that is, you know, in a way takes place a lot kind of in pre-integration communities. There would often be a community photographer. There's many representations of this throughout America. I mean, there's people like Teenie Harris, who kind of singularly has one of the largest archives of Black American life. Um, and that was in Pittsburgh. Or you have, so you kind of have a figure like that in many communities. And so I would look at these images and study them, and there's something that come multiple things that come through to me. One is their technical proficiency. A lot of these images were like painstakingly beautiful, and a lot of that would come from almost an element of business or commerce, having the better product than the next guy in town. So it's not really necessarily for artistic means, but to be able to produce the most legible and vivid image, which I find kind of interesting, because it's not this virtue of being like a brilliant artist. There's something that's like so like working class about that approach to image making. So that really struck me, but also the use of photography to create a new kind of public consciousness around Black life, when there was so many images that painted bad images. I think there was a very early on, from the beginning of photography, there is a kind of push back against that canon from Black photographers. And so a lot of this inspired me, and I wanted to make this work feel in step with that archive, to maybe aim towards how far we haven't come from this history, or what is the way in which we can participate in it that isn't, as I said, something that feels maybe it's reductive or performative gesture of only seeing yourself within a historical context, but also an ability to be an aesthetic statement. I mean, I think that people, it's stylized, it's glamour, it's drama, it's not so heavy, and it's
Yeah.
fun. It's a fun to it. So I'm kind of intentionally creating that, avoiding things like phones and COVID masks and license plates and Toyota Corollas, and a lot of the modern noise. So
Yeah.
that was pretty painstaking to make sure that everything was, but also my choice of equipment and materials.
Mm. Well, I had to go back and see your show again today. It was such a beautiful series, and I love actually the way you instill this very gentle pace to the community, which, as you say, is very different from different representations. So yeah, thank you very much, for your answer.
Of course, yes. And I have a question here about some inspirations. Um, I can just speak to a few of my main inspirations. I would say, like, at the top of the list would probably be Milton Rogovin, who was a photographer from Buffalo, New York, who photographed the end of the steel industry and coal mining and relationships between labor and family life. Also, someone who I really look up to is Russell Lee, who is a Texas photographer. He ended up in Texas, but he was a prolific FSA photographer. Yeah, here, I'll put these in the chat.
I'll do it. Don't worry.
Okay. Yeah, Milton Rogovin, Russell Lee, um, you know, someone who else, I mean, I look at so much work, so it's kind of hard. I'm always obsessed with different things from different weeks. You know, people like, I really enjoy unsung, like people in photography, someone whose archive was less known. So yeah, we'll definitely circle back on some of the influences, but you know, yeah, there's a lot that I look at. It's it can get a bit heavy.
Someone you mentioned to me whilst we had the first conversation about the book was, and I'm going to butcher the name, Early Hundnell Jr.
Yes, early Hudnall Jr.
Yeah, who I didn't know before you mentioned them.
Yes, he's a Houston-based photographer. I'll put him in the chat here. I'll put it in the wrong place. But yeah, he's actually a kind of a mentor of mine. He's based in Houston, and we did a conversation for True Photo Journal, which is a London-based publication, speaking about both of our work. So he, in the image you pointed out of the brothers at the parade, that's a big homage to early Hudnall and his kind of use of dark light and kind of shimmering of skin. Yeah, they're a lot of inspiration,
And Consuelo Kanaga.
is Consuelo Kanaga a bit of like a kind of pictorial surrealist, very like in the kind of tradition of like Stieglitz. But yeah, you know, there's a lot of I could go down a lot of other paths if we keep talking, you know, when speaking about some of this work, because I have so many thoughts and ideas about them.
And Roy de Carava, who had a show in the 80s at the Flappers Gallery.
Oh wow, that's amazing.
Might have been, but I might might not remember my PhD so well, but it might have been his first UK show.
Wow, yeah, he's a huge inspiration, and to get to have some of his work in my show here in New York was a big honor.
Yeah. I guess, Louisa, we are sort of arriving at the end of our time, right?
Yes. Thank you both so much for your time today and for the insight into your work, Rahim. And Taous, you always speak so beautifully about photography. If you're based in London, do pop by the gallery and see Rahim's work. It's on display until June, along with the other nominees for the Deutsche Börse Photography Foundation Prize. Thank you, Rahim and Taous, for your time today, and to you all for your really interesting questions and contributions. And we have our next talk with Christina de Mello. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. At the end of April on Zoom as well. And we have 2 in-person talks the week of the prize announcement in May. And hopefully we see you there if you're able to come in London. Thank you everyone for your time today. And Rahim, Taous, thank you especially.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day, Rahim.
Yes,
thank you for your beautiful work, both of you. Thank you.